Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled The West on Fire, and we're joined by William Deverell from the University of Southern California. Today is March the 16th, 2021. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education Programs at the National Humanities Center. On behalf of Libby, Mike, my team, as well as our graduate student interns, Hannah, Carly, and Josh, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. In my experience, this is the time of the school year, the academic year, regardless of what grade or level you're teaching, where things get a little hazy and blurry. Forget the pandemic, forget all the other things that are going on in our world. This is one of those times when spring is almost here, when students are getting a little restless and antsy, and you certainly are as well. I hope you've had a good day at school, and I'm really pleased that you're able to join us tonight after a long day of working with students in some form or fashion. In particular, I'd like to welcome some folks that I see from a variety of levels. Vivian is joining us tonight from Broadway Elementary. Great to have Vivian with us. Ashley at Holmes Middle, and Brittany at Tunstall High School. So we've got the full K-12 spectrum represented in the audience tonight. Really pleased to see Lisa from the St. Anne Schools in New York. Lisa, this is the first time I've seen you in our audience. Welcome. And Montoya is back. Montoya is a staff member at the Indianapolis Public Library. I do hope that you use this time in the chat box to interact with each other, to get to know each other in the ways that we do in this virtual space, and help develop this community of our webinars. The National Humanities Center is in very much the same position that many of you are. That is to say, we're dealing the best we can with the pandemic and with the changes and the disruptions in our world. One thing I can say, though, even this year, when most of the fellows who have joined us in person and in residence are adhering to the public safety protocols, again, just like all of the organizations and the buildings that you work in. But one thing that I've still seen to be true is that when current events happen, when contemporary issues reveal, when questions emerge in our sort of current understanding of things, our fellows are very, very interested in offering their expertise and their authority and their background and their voice. It's funny, tonight's session was actually scheduled, a year ago this time, and it was in large part to much of the current events that were happening in our world at the time, which seems to be cyclical, seems to be annual. But the center is one place. I would encourage you to also look in your own communities for universities and centers like the one that Bill runs at USC that has that same kind of expertise, that same kind of interest in connecting with the community, connecting with classrooms. I'd like to think the center is a good hub for this to happen on a national and even international level, but don't forget the folks in your own backyard. And I suspect that many of you have worked with Professor Deverell in Southern California in some way along the same kinds of same approaches. If you're interested in further resources on this topic and any topic, I would encourage you to use the Humanities in Class digital library as often as you like. While this is a teacher-facing resource, it is a place where your students can sign up to get library cards as well, and therefore interact with the resources, the materials, the readings, the recordings of sessions like tonight's webinar to interact with material that you think might be appropriate. I'd encourage you to go in and start to look around using keyword searches for the topics where you might have some gaps in your own resources, or you might want some more understandings. You'll certainly find all the resources from the National Humanities Center, but I'm really pleased that over 80 other organizations, including the Huntington Library, are also making their resources available through this platform. So take a look, search for the things that might make sense based on your interests tonight, whether that's fire or Western history as keywords. And again, start to find all these materials cross-discoverable in an OER platform that you can trust and are free and openly licensed. That does include, by the way, joining the Humanities in Class webinar series group. Before each session, we send several reminder emails, and I hope that you do notice that there are pre-readings that our visiting scholars have pulled together and made available for you in advance of our sessions. I'm going to drop the link right now in the chat box for all the resources associated with tonight's webinar. It could be that you're busy professionals and you haven't had a chance to look through them. That's okay. But I would encourage you to go back and take a look at these, use them to reflect on tonight's conversation, perhaps modify them or remix them in a way that makes sense for your own instruction. We are in the back quarter, third, fifth of our webinar series this year. It's been wonderful to be joining you on a weekly, sometimes twice a week basis. We have 11 webinars left, and that does include a somewhat companion webinar, themed webinar with Sarah Shields. I see Sarah in the room tonight, joining me from Chapel Hill. Please do take a look at our schedule. We've got 11 sessions left. We still have plenty of room if you'd like to sign up or share these with your colleagues. Could be that when you initially signed up last summer, you weren't quite sure of your spring calendar. Now maybe it's revealed itself a little bit more to you, and you can join us for one of these upcoming sessions. Each of our webinars does earn you 5 professional development credit hours. For all you folks from LA, that does equal 1 salary point. But if you'd like to spend a little bit more immersive time, I'd also encourage you to take a look at our online course catalog. Each course is about 5 hours of work per week, and it does earn you 35 professional credit hours, which again is approved in 20 states and also Los Angeles Unified. I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their hard work this year, again, particularly with the disruptions that we're all experiencing. We have opened our application portal for next year's cohort for the Teacher Advisory Council. And if any of you who have spent many of your evenings with us would like to have a more active and engaged role, if you'd like to apply, I really do encourage you to do so. Applications are due by May the 3rd, and you'll notice that it does ask that you get a letter of support from your administrator. Just to be clear, we ask for that letter not as much to have a reference for you personally. Honestly, it's to make sure that your administration knows that we're going to be bringing you to North Carolina for a few days in the fall, and we don't want anybody to say to you later on that they didn't realize that was part of the deal. So it really goes both ways. It protects you and it gives you their support, their endorsement, but it also allows us to see a little bit more of your teaching portfolio. Tonight's webinar is driven by a PowerPoint and our voices, but probably the most important part is the chat box and the questions that you're going to be providing. As the moderator, I'll bring those questions to Professor Deverell at the appropriate time. I would encourage you to use the audience chat to banter with each other, ask questions of each other. But if you'd like to ask something more formally, please do use the Ask Professor Deverell tab, and that will go privately to me. And again, I'll queue those up and bring those to the professor as we move forward. So again, you have joined us for tonight's Humanities in Class webinar. It's titled The West on Fire. I'm joined by William Deverell. He's the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, based at the University of Southern California. I'm also really pleased to welcome one of our current TAC members, David Tao. David is a teacher in San Rafael, up the one somewhere up the coastline in Northern California. David's going to be with us tonight, sharing resources of materials that he's curated, asking questions, and generally connecting what we talk about back to instruction and to the classroom. So, Bill, I'm so pleased that you're able to join us now for a second webinar. Bill, can you hear me out in Southern California?
I hear you loud and clear, Andy, and I'm delighted to be here again.
Thank you so much. And, Bill, before I turn the PowerPoint over to you, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a little bit of a personal question just to frame tonight's conversation. As you might recall, the last time we saw each other physically was in some kind of outdoor bar or brewery in somewhere in downtown Los Angeles. I remember you giving me directions by saying, look for the plane wing. And I remember you telling me then that as an historian, as a professional historian, you see that fire will now become one of the most important things to study. Tell us a little bit more about that, just from your own professional perspective. Why is this now an emerging field or topic or theme that we really do need to take seriously?
Great question, Andy. I want to thank you and your colleagues and David as well for joining us tonight or making tonight possible. I really loved my last interaction with you all and with the folks in the chat and watching this, so I'm thrilled to be here. So I do remember that conversation, and I think I do think that's what I said, that fire will become, and I think it has become. I think fire is maybe particularly through the American West, but obviously we live on a globe that's being affected by climate change and drought cycles, and so fire, we need only look to Australia in the recent past. But fire is just, as you mentioned earlier in your remarks, about all of our educational and professional and pedagogical interest in current events. And then I think implicitly in that was a notion that we can utilize humanities scholarship, investigation, and research to peel back the complexities and intricacies of current events. So it's hard to imagine a more pressing environmental issue than fire. And what we're trying to do with this project I'm about to talk about is utilize humanities and other disciplinary research tools to come to grips with this really remarkably important contemporary issue. And as I end tonight, I'll put that in some high relief with just a kind of catalog of Western fire. But I think the intervening year from a little more than a year from when we met and talked this over, it's just been catastrophic. The summer of 2020 was catastrophic across the American West in terms of fire. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to study it and try to come to grips with it and utilize it as a platform to educate our students.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe it that way because, I intentionally asked in the opening slide, the opening question, for an event or for a way in which history has shaped history or changed history. And I got a lot of the responses that I anticipated, things like the great library burning in Alexandria back in the 3rd century BC, or the Great Fires of London or New York or Chicago, all these towns that have these destructive events. Even the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, near one of our guests tonight, Jackie Dukes, there was an event. But it sounds like you're describing it in much more long view terms than just a fire that occurs and is extinguished.
Yes, I think I am. And I'm also talking, as I get further into this evening, I'm talking about trying to wrestle with fire not as a discrete event. So all those fire events you mentioned, while they might be huge and catastrophic, they're generally termed as discrete events. Like the fire ignites, it burns, it's put out or it goes out, and that's it. And I think there are other ways that are more important to think about fire as a lasting consequential event on the landscape, in lives, certainly with lives lost and lives irrevocably changed. So one thing we're trying to do through this work we're involved in out here in Southern California is to broaden our conception of fire as something far more consequential than even a catastrophic event.
Fantastic. Thank you for setting that tone and that flavor. We look forward to how you're going to appeal this for us. So I'm going to give you control of the PowerPoint, and again, as the moderator, I'll be bringing you questions on occasion to help clarify things for our audience.
That's great. And thanks, Andy. And let me urge David, as my partner here this evening, please interact in any way you feel appropriate, David. We're thrilled to have you involved as well, as integrally as you are. So let me just move forward here. Andy has brought me here, Andy and the team have brought me here, I think in part because the work I do at USC in the Huntington Library is divided into smaller and larger initiatives that we work on. They all share fascination and importance of the history and culture of generally the 18th and 19th and 20th century American West. I see a lot of educational colleagues here from LAUSD, which I have been privileged to work with in the past and the present with a number of K-12 educators. I urge the LAUSD teachers in particular, if you think that the work we're doing has a kind of interface with your lesson plans or your units or even your student research and exercises, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Andy mentioned earlier the issues that we all take into public outreach and public interface. We are very committed to that as well. So,
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It looks like from the chat that that your audio is a little bit low. I'm going to do two things. The first, I'm going to go back to slide 14. Hey, folks, if you're having a hard time hearing, look at number 2 arrow right there. There's a volume button just above the audience chat box. Make sure that's cranked up, please. And Bill, if you can, maybe you might even lean a little closer to your microphone and talk a little bit louder.
You got it. I hope that's better. I'm happy to speak louder in my professorial voice. It's easy. So, Andy, feel free to interrupt me again if I can even pump it up more than that. I'm happy to.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. So the work we do is divided into these various initiatives and projects that always have a public interface. And it's academic work, but it's also very, very attuned to issues the public is concerned about and that we also think we can learn from and dialogue with. So the West on Fire is one such project. It is a 3-year project at this point, but I'm hopeful that with philanthropic and other funding, we can extend this out 5 or even 10 years of work. It's a large, slightly unwieldy project for us, but we've been thrilled about it. A lot of what I have to say this evening is based on being into the 3 years only about 6 months. And so we know some things, and I'm delighted to share them, but we also have a lot of terrain to cover over the next 2.5 years. The project aims to educate a broad as possible, actually, cross-section of the public in issues germane to contemporary urban wildfire, the urban wildfire interface, which I'll explain in a minute, and the historical underpinnings of that reach back, thanks to some of the disciplinary scholars we have on our team, that reach back millennia or even further. So our whole aim is to examine the consequences of, reasons for, and perhaps solutions to the astonishing rise in catastrophic wildfire across the American West. And we're utilizing the humanities as our key research tool, but not the only one. And as a consequence of that interdisciplinary flavor or commitment, our working team includes probably, certainly more than a dozen different disciplines. We have about 36 members of our workshop, and we're investigating Western fire across a number of case studies and facets that I'm about to address with you. So if you take a look at this opening slide, some of the issues, and I'll hew closely to this during my talk, some of the issues, and this is probably not going to be exactly in sequence of what my slides and my talk, my remarks are tonight, but nonetheless, you see Indigenous use of fire. It's a critical piece for what we're up to. Learning from Indigenous partners and learning from Indigenous collaborators, which I'll peel back during the course of my remarks. We're very interested in the European and Anglo-European prohibition of Indigenous fire, which I'll talk about, which had really grave consequences, all kinds of grave consequences that are important to study and understand. Then we grapple with the American period of Western conquest. In California, the American period, of course, coincidental with and tied to the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 and California statehood in 1850. And then this modern transition of fire, which I'll talk about, to different kinds of fire, different categorical understandings of fire. The major takeaway in a lot of respects is this contemporary backdrop line that Western fire on the Western landscapes and into the Western foothills is bigger and more destructive, more dangerous, and more often. Simply stated, fire has arrived. It's always been with us, but it's arrived in the last generation as a momentous force on the landscape, oftentimes terrifying and dangerous, but also I think there are other ways to look at it as well, which we'll talk about. And as I mentioned about the workshop, we have different disciplinary approaches to fire, which I'm happy to share with you all. And you can imagine, just looking at, let's say, a wildfire, how many different disciplines could be implicated in trying to address the problems that ensue. So we're trying to draw from those. And then just some points about what we're up to. We're stretching our histories back. I'm getting out of my 19th and 20th century comfort zone of Western American history. We're moving into atmospheric issues and climate change and meteorological issues by definition, because they're immensely tied and closely tied to wildfire expansion across the West. We are recognizing the really large impact of Western suburban growth that we tend to, in the post-World War II period, put into the flat landscapes of the American West. Southern Los Angeles County, Northern Orange County are cases in point. But as many of you know, and may come from school districts or neighborhoods, suburban growth has continued in the post-1970s period to move into formerly uninhabited and unstructured landscapes higher into the foothills and into the canyons of wildfire interface. So we're addressing that as well. We have issues and questions about the defense of public property when wildfires come in and how much resources are used to save structures and potentially save lives. And then the aftermath of fire when we see oftentimes the structures rebuilt precisely where they've been before. And we want to question that a little bit, or at least raise a dialogue. And we have some questions about the coordination of fire response in governance and municipalities. I find let's say across California, that the hierarchical public coordination response is focused on an outfit like CAL FIRE, a very, very important fire suppression, firefighting, and fire mitigation public entity in California, but not necessarily as coordinated with other units or agencies or municipalities or regulatory bodies as perhaps it ought to be. And then we're interested in the fire suppression culture. We're going to spend some time here talking about Smokey Bear because of his importance in American perceptions of fire. We're certainly going to talk more about Indigenous practices. And then I mentioned the lack of focus on fire as a discrete event. We're going to talk about archives and oral histories because if we're right, and I think we can probably all stipulate that fire is at the very least very important these days, if not the critical environmental feature on our landscapes pertaining to all this landscape and climate change. Assuming that's correct, it's incumbent upon us to collect, catalog, preserve, and save, otherwise save and study new sources of fire. And one of the best and most critical ways to do that is to gather up ambitious oral history projects and put people in the field to interview those whose lives have been affected perhaps forever by fire. And then lastly, because we're humanists, I do want to note, and many of you are likely familiar with this, there's a long and vaunted tradition, literary tradition, of writing about fire in the American West that goes, of course, back to Indigenous oral stories, but in the more recent times, in the more recent centuries, some remarkable works of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction about fire, and we're increasingly bringing those to the attention of journalists and students. And then, just to close, what is this concept of good fire, and can we live with good fire on our landscape, and shouldn't we? Okay, so that's a brief introduction of some of the themes I'd care to cover, mostly in sequence to that outline, but I'll bounce around a little bit as well. Fire in the last couple of years, I'm going to speak broadly about the American West, but with a particular valence on California and Southern California. Many of you Californians are familiar with this. We used to mark a kind of seasonal attachment to fire season, which sort of fit the obvious non-winter and non-late fall months. But now we consider fire season 12 months a year, and the data supports that. Fires are absolutely with us, and as we see from, let's say, this recent fire in 2018 on the Southern California coast upwards of Santa Barbara, the fires are getting just astonishingly big and have catastrophic consequences. So even if we weren't educators, even if our positions in the society were not in an educational role, we need to know more about fire. But it's particularly incumbent upon us as educators, I think. The visual representation of fire, you can barely see this man. There's a man there in the center watering down a structure just underneath the top rise of that hill. This is in Southern California, Valley Terrace. Firefighters encroaching more and more on structures that are built, as I say, where previously they largely have been uninhabited and unstructured landscapes. There's a history to this. And it's a history we're familiar with if we study the American West. This is in my home state of Colorado, this is a really devastating fire at Mesa Verde National Monument, or National Park, which didn't particularly encroach upon the native structures in the Mesa Verde housing structures and platforms in the grottos of the hills, of the rocks there. But the fire itself does all kinds of things in terms of rendering the landscape dangerous, particularly through smoke, which I'll talk about as well. So it's touching every aspect of our lives and culture across the West. Here's a a fairly recent fire regime map that's color-coded in terms of from the very light, kind of light blue, greenish, down into the dark red, about fire frequency per year, an annual frequency of fire. I suspect this map is now out of date. It's a reasonably recent map, and I didn't check exactly when it is, but I think the frequency colors of this, in other words, I think if we did it today, the map would be far more red than it is now, with much more increased frequency of fire.
Professor, may I ask a clarifying question?
Yep.
As we talk about fires, particularly when you show a map like this or some of the images you just did, are you drawing any distinction in the origin of that fire? In other words, lightning strike and natural events versus arson and other man-made kinds of catalysts?
I wasn't here, Andy, but there are people who do that, and it seems as if the takeaway from much of the studies across the Great Basin in the West and the Rockies is that human-caused fire is absolutely a phenomenon, but deliberate human-caused fire, as in arson, is far less frequent than we might in popular culture assume. So sparks from this or that mechanical equipment, recklessness on the landscape with fire, that is oftentimes an ignition charge. Arson itself, not as much. And then lightning strike, absolutely, quite often. And then other kind of environmental ignition points that may not need lightning, but are, magnification through broken glass, that kind of thing. So I think it's important to remember that the arson-caused fire, while it does happen, is not as common as we might otherwise think.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and one that I think speaks a lot to the humanities perspectives that you're bringing to this. I have one other clarifying question for you. When we use the term the West or Western U.S., define that for us geographically. Are we talking about everything as you have in the map west of the Mississippi, or what is the West?
So I'm tempted to be facetious and say, how long do you have, Andy? Because this gets Western historians into no longer fistfights, but Western historians can argue till the cows come home about definitional boundaries of the American West. But this map sort of helps us out. There's a green swath there, essentially. Eastern Colorado, eastern Wyoming, and then into the plains. Somewhere in there is the isohedral line where irrigable crops to the east of it don't need artificial irrigation means to grow, and to the west of it do. And so that tends to be a reasonable dividing line for the American West. But Kansans will oftentimes pick a fight with us Coloradans who say we're in the West and you're not. So it's a moving target. But, and I say this with some trepidation, I think fire actually will probably help us in a kind of consequentially tragic way. I think fire will help us define the West more and more. In other words, there's going to be some line established by the frequency and consequences of fire, east of which will be less and west of which will be more. And so I think we're in the midst right now of redefining boundaries in our part of North America because of fire, and probably not just our part of North America, frankly, probably most, if not all, of North America.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, so traditionally, if you study Western history and you study fire, you get at it one of two ways, traditionally. One, through anthropology, ethnography, and Native American studies. You grapple with indigenous understandings, practices, and management of fire on the landscape. I'll get to that more in a bit. Or you understand fire as a destructive force in the built landscape. And the classic case study of that are the mining towns, and generally the gold and silver rushes themselves, period, because the gold and silver rushes and others, other metals, precious minerals and metals, but mostly gold and silver. The gold and silver rushes, which we date to 1848, California, and then moving into the interior in the 1850s and 60s. They exhausted the local timber supply. They made forever ecological impact on the landscapes of the interior and mountainscapes of the American West and the Western Sierra foothills. And by definition, that's wood. And the heat source and cooking source were open pit or open access wood. And as you see here from this town, Western mining towns, because in some measure they want to save the landscape for mining and create density when they can to cram everybody into dense, and also they want to amalgamate as a community, but there's a lot of reasons why Western towns are dense. They're close together, they're dense, and oftentimes the water source has been utilized for mining practices. And so getting easily available water to fight fire, and water really is the only firefighting technique of the middle of the 19th century, is tricky. And so I defy the historical record to show me a mining town from Saskatchewan down to Baja that did not burn. In fact, many of them burned serially over the course of 5-10 years. They boom and bust, and oftentimes their bust is provoked by fire. So these are people that are very familiar with fire, but it's fire in it's not exactly urban, but what we might call the built communities and built landscapes of human congregation. Okay, so that tends to be the ways in which we understand fire in the American West if we move past indigenous practices pre-contact. Here's another, the photographic evidence is rich of this density and the preponderance of wood. These little towns would have volunteer fire departments, which it's a bucket brigade, and tended to be remarkably ineffective. Now, that understanding in the American West it reaches its pinnacle in a lot of ways with the San Francisco earthquake and fire complex of 1906. Remarkable photographic evidence of the city brought to its knees by the consequences of earthquake, fire, and then the fire suppression techniques, which are oftentimes, as many people in the room, and particularly our Northern Californians will know, oftentimes utilize dynamite and other explosive devices to not exactly create fire breaks, but to bring down structures in the path of the fire and hope that you would stop that fire. And that got out of control as well. So the efficiency of dynamite and explosives was not very high. So this urban, remarkable photograph, see the scene painter in the foreground painting the scenes of destruction in the spring of 1906 in San Francisco. So that's the classic case of Western fire in dense urban or village environments. Well, that's changed now. We may have firefighters in the crowd this evening, or people who come from firefighting families. Of course, urban and suburban firefighters still perform remarkably critical first responder duties, but building materials, fire suppression techniques, sprinklers in the ceiling, halon and other fire suppressant gases, our fire structure fires have gone down precipitously, and I think we could probably graph a counterposed response that as structure fires in, let's say, the cities and towns of the American West have declined, particularly structure fires that burn from structure to structure to structure to structure. As those have declined over the past multiple generations, urban wildfire, the urban wildfire interface, basically where people come up against, either through recreation or largely houses, come up against firescapes on the more or less open terrain of the American West. Just think wildfire. Whatever your mind conjures up about wildfire, that's what I mean. Those have increased probably exponentially. But I think there is a relationship between those two events. And partly what I think is going on, and I'd like to have other disciplines weigh in to our project to help us, I think those of us that live in suburban settings, we've defamiliarized ourselves with fire. We've lost touch with fire, and we've oftentimes allowed fire simply to be perceived as bad. And part of what we're up to is to say it's much more complicated than that. But part of the consequence of thinking of fire as bad is that we may get bigger and badder and worse fires because of that perception. So partly what we're trying to do, and I think we can start as young as our students start, is to teach about fire and understand more about fire and understand these patterns on the landscape that teach us about fire. Now,
Bill, Professor, if I can ask a question that's kind of bubbling up in the audience chat, to hear you describe it that way, in some ways means is it to animate an inanimate object, fire? Is it to personify it? Is it to demystify it? So talk to us a little bit more about this notion of not ascribing bad and good intentions or consequences even to fire, particularly with young students. How do you go about doing that?
that is a really fascinating question. I think by and large, there is an anthropomorphic tendency in our view of fire in the American West, occupied no more so than in the furry persona of Smokey Bear, and we'll get to him. But I do think, just think about the adjectives that we utilize to describe really all kinds of environmental actors on the landscape. We anthropomorphize these as angry or vicious or temperamental or tempestuous. You know, we do it with floodwaters, we do it with debris flow, we do it with avalanche, we do it with fire, we do it with wind, hurricanes.
We give hurricanes human names.
Exactly. So I do think we need to think a little bit differently about that. I think all of us probably could be better educated as to the chemical properties of fire and fire's consumption of fuel, what that is all about. So I do, our project is early enough now that essentially we've got eyes and ears wide open for anyone who can tell us more about fire, because we may understand it at a fairly elemental level as educators. It's hot and don't go there and don't put your hand there and let's put it out. Well, I think obviously there's a deeper history to what this actor is on the landscape and how we should live with it, which is where we're trying to go with some of our work.
That's a great point. I don't want to derail our sequence too much, but I am fascinated by where and how and when fire became this kind of negative connotation, because it wasn't that long ago, particularly in the West, that the personal pan pizza-sized fire was your warmth, your security, your light in the middle of the night, right? The fire was a very, very good thing. And it's funny how that's really shifted.
I think it has shifted. I think we're living in a kind of revolutionary resizing of our opinions and attitudes towards fire. And part of that is fairly obvious as to why, because we are living in a pyrocene, and it's everywhere, and it is a huge force on the landscape. So we're trying to grapple with that. Now, one of the dimensions, this is I'm going to just go into a facet here of what we're doing that may reverberate with some of the folks here this evening in terms of their approach or their understandings of fire. So back to the kind of fire is not a discrete actor all by itself. There are consequences. One of the aspects that we're very, very interested in has everything to do with public health. Obviously, fire can take lives. And in California, we've seen the tragedy of that over and over again in the last several fire seasons or fire months, or as I said, fires all the time. But that last catastrophic fires have taken a very, very high number of lives in their wakes. But there are other public health effects too, obviously. And this slide shows some of them. This slide shows more. This is wildfire smoke moving across, one kind of jet stream actor or another. Wildfire smoke is increasingly being recognized as a significant public health challenge. I'm interested in the American West, but I think it obviously goes beyond that, in part because wildfire smoke travels. And so we're working with a set of emergency medicine people, preventive medicine people, and people who study respiratory ailments and diseases. And wildfire as a creator of wildfire smoke and the impacts of wildfire smoke on particularly vulnerable populations with respiratory distress otherwise, probably inhibited by COVID. I haven't seen the data yet, but one could imagine. This is a very big problem. And the historians can do some work, the humanists can do some work on this, But by and large, this is the work of people trained in public health, atmospheric chemistry, preventive medicine, and some at the front ranks of sociology and ethnography. We're working with members of our team who have gone into some of the migrant farm worker camps in northern LA County and southern Santa Barbara County that are vegetable pickers and fruit pickers, strawberry pickers. These folks oftentimes live in canyons, in tent communities, sometimes provided by the growers, sometimes not. And the canyons are oftentimes funnels for smoke, given the wind patterns up there at the coast. And sometimes these folks are more vulnerable because of previous health effects or a lack of first-rate medical care. And so we're seeing, and then during COVID, many of these people were classified as essential workers because they're in the food stream or food system, food chain. So we've got case studies of smoke inhalation, which we usually think of smoke inhalation in a building. Someone gets trapped in a building and is challenged by smoke inhalation. Smoke inhalation is everywhere now. And we're working with an atmospheric chemist who said one of the great aspects of her research these days is that wildfire smoke seems to behave differently in the atmosphere than other smoke, which I have to admit, I don't know what that means, but I'm fascinated by it because I think the conclusion she's reaching is that it coheres longer and it moves further. And so wildfire smoke can inhibit the health of people, as we might say, downstream, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. So part of our research is with the increase in wildfire, you're obviously getting an increase in smoke, and there's a great indication of it. So pulling together that kind of analysis is important to what we're up to educate the public, and perhaps to think about ways in which wildfire smoke inhalation and the dangers it provokes can be inhibited by personal protective gear that may become more common in the midst of wildfire. And smoke, a lot of wildfire smoke's invisible, or at least the particulates are invisible. And then once it gets to the visibility level of this slide, it's obviously very dangerous. Okay, so now we're going to move into a kind of cultural feature and facet of the work we're doing, and that's this little guy. So many of you, I suspect probably everyone, is familiar with Smokey Bear, but the history of this mascot is itself a fascinating journey into American popular culture, firefighting culture, fire suppression culture, and the federal government. It turns out that Smokey Bear, this is him. He was rescued from a fire in southern New Mexico, not terribly long after the Second World War ended, sometime in the 1950s, and he was put into the Washington Zoo, and he was famous. He had his own zip code because so many children wrote to him, and he lived well into his, I want to say he lived deep into his 40s or 50s. But in any event, a rescued bear who was named Smokey Bear and then became a national icon. Well, the mascot Smokey Bear, that's not a real bear, the cartoon or puppet or Smokey Bear we recognize from flyers, etc., predates this one. In the Second World War, as the United States embarked on its propaganda campaigns to support the war effort, and began to work on issues of national community building, etc. The precursor to the Ad Council, which was a wing of the federal government's wartime acts, or wartime powers, to put forth flyers and posters and whatnot to support the war effort. One of the first things that wartime Ad Council came up with was a campaign to try to educate the public, particularly the Western American public, precisely at the moment of internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans, that the Japanese nation had launched a campaign to light the Western forests on fire and to inhibit the war effort by internal destruction of a natural resource. The truth is the Japanese government did have plans to float little paper balloons with a kind of napalmy substance or something in them over western forests and attempt to light them on fire. It was not particularly successful and kind of a shot in the dark and not very ambitiously executed. However, as a consequence of being worried about this, the federal government's Ad Council created a campaign around keeping an eye on the western forests through the watchful tutelage of this figure, Smokey Bear. And Smokey Bear, if you remember, there's a series of slogans attached to him as he comes into national view. But Smokey Bear, created by the Wartime Ad Council, and still superintended by the Ad Council, which is now no longer a wartime operation, obviously, but a federal project. Smokey's tagline is, the famous one, is only you can prevent forest fires. And Smokey, coming out of particularly the fame and rise of Bambi by the Walt Disney Company, and Bambi's anthropomorphic cuteness as a creature of the forest that is obviously at certain moments traumatized by tragic wildfire, Bambi becomes the model upon which Smokey is designed and produced in flyers, leaflets, and whatnot as a watchful eye, both keeping an eye on the forest with his campaign hat on and also keeping an eye on you in a kind of Uncle Sam visage, that you must protect the forest from forest fires. It is remarkably successful. Smokey is beloved. Smokey is iconic. And Smokey has story after story written about him. And as I say, children would write to the real bear at the zoo. Now, part of the takeaway of this intervening 70 years or so, is that the message of Smokey has now become redone, revised, reimagined, because the United States Forest Service and other entities that advise them about this have recognized that while Smokey for children probably does a lot of good, because if you remember, part of Smokey's appeal is he's oftentimes focused on matches. So part of Smokey's appeal is just be careful with fire, implicitly or otherwise, and be careful with matches. And I don't think we would argue against the importance of that, particularly in a wilderness setting. But part of the takeaway from Smokey's long endured message is there's a fire, put it out. And that became Smokey's kind of maybe less voiced, but certainly understood instructions to millions of Americans that fire was to be suppressed. It's also very interesting to me that as time goes on, Smokey gets more buff and more buff and more buff. There's a kind of Smokey and dad jeans earlier look, and then Smokey pumps out his chest and gets bigger and bolder and becomes a larger bear that you kind of don't want to go against. So, this is a powerful, simple point of view with a recognizable anthropomorphic standing up bear in a pair of dungarees telling you, and he's holding Bambi, for goodness sake, telling you that this is, terrible. Now, as I say, the message of Smokey over time has undergone some change. There he is as a hot air balloon down in the Santa Fe hot air balloon. He's identified with New Mexico as a New Mexican, the real bear, and then this Smokey. Look at this. This is now the phrase. Only you can prevent wildfires, not forest fires, wildfires. There's a difference, of course, and it's also a wildfire is, out of control, wild, burned without supervision or burned without ignition deliberation. A forest fire might be something different. And so as we see our stance to fire changing across the entirety of the American West, our chief spokesperson in our culture for address of fire is changing his message. They considered getting rid of him, but they're not going to get rid of him because he's so iconic. A friend of mine who's the chief historian of the United States Forest Service told me a story that when he was a seasonal firefighter in Utah, there was a 4th of July parade that the Forest Service was to participate in the heat of southern Utah. And as they were preparing for the parade, his supervisor said, "Hey, new guy, come with me." And my friend, who's now a big wheel with the Forest Service, said he knew something was up when the first place they took him was the freezer. And he had to wear a gel pack of a vest filled with freezing gel so that he didn't die in the Smokey Bear fur outfit that he had to wear in the parade. But he said children just responded to him. He's sort of like Santa Claus of the forest. So the Forest Service recognizes the power of that, and he's beloved, but they're going to change his message, and we're going to see it more like this.
Bill, I feel like I need to apologize at this point to all of my fellow Gen Xers who are now realizing that Smokey Bear was a big propaganda part of our life. Thank you for puncturing yet another bubble in my background.
What is history for, Andy? Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, okay. So let's drift into another facet of this, which is in part and parcel to the changing view of wildfire in the American West and its endemic qualities. And that's to go to Indigenous fire history. I had not realized until fairly recently that a lot of the iconic imagery that I associate with European encounters with native, let's say North America or native the American West, more than I had ever expected, they feature smoke and fire. And it's almost, I mean, the Indigenous collaborators we work with, their response is yes, of course. But a lot of the education I received in graduate school and since then that encounters this kind of visual depiction of fire and smoke in Indigenous hands or Indigenous practice had sailed right over my head. And now we're in an era where our appreciation of and understandings of and willingness to listen to Native American fire practice is both fascinating and critical. So this is obviously an early, probably 16th century woodcut or some kind of print of Indigenous peoples, and the scholarly community says that in the background there, that's wildfire or fire smoke. Now, the point is, obviously Indigenous people knew fire and had domesticated fire, but they also utilized fire for a variety of purposes. To move game around, they use it as a tool of warfare. They use it because they understand the germination power of fire smoke and fire heat for certain seed pods. It's certainly woven into cultural and spiritual practice. And so there's a wealth of Indigenous knowledge about fire that obviously continues into this day. When we can work with our Indigenous partners and learn from them about this, we're all the better because we understand our topic so much better. So again, it's really small, I apologize, but this is a Harper's Weekly from the latter 19th century. That's a Plains warrior, horsebacked, and then he's utilizing fire, probably either as a tool to move high protein game, think elk or buffalo, or as a warfare device to move or scatter enemies. But it was important enough to feature on the cover of Harper's Weekly as an indication of Indigenous fire practice and fire use. This one's very hard to see, but it's a sketch from the Huntington Library of 1850 California. And it's the Sierras by a very talented artist. You can't really see this, but I'll show you in a second. Over to the right-hand side, you see a little pronghorn antelope, and then in the background, of course, some Sierra foothills. It looks kind of like the Owens Valley or White Mountains, but you can't see it so clearly here. But in the just to the right of the middle line of this drawing, just to the right and up in the foothills, there is a fairly substantial plume of smoke, which, had we not had the label that the artist put on it, we might assume might be lightning caused or otherwise. But, and again, I apologize, this is probably too small. If you were, oh, there you can see it. In the very bottom of his drawing, he labels it Indian fire. So an understanding of Indigenous Californians' use of fire for this or that purpose in 1850, which it's fascinating in part because the indigenous use of fire had been clamped down upon by the Franciscans who built the mission system in California and elsewhere. They viewed it as a promiscuous use of something godly, and they did not like the lack of discipline of it, and I think they also were afraid of it. So Franciscans and then other regime and province administrators penalized punitively Indian use of fire in the embrace of the mission system or the towns that sprung up around and to support the mission system across the American Southwest and into Baja. So Indian fire, it's still going to be practiced because it's so important, but the appreciation of it and understanding of it is not going to come from European and Anglo-European populations. This is a case study of my lack of understanding of this. This is a Plains couple, probably around 1870 or so. I think I once thought that the background above the man's head is the emulsion on the picture that created this kind of blur. And it's not true. Apparently that's a fire. And it's been studied as such by the people who know this photograph better than I. And it was claimed as indigenous use of fire for, again, this or that purpose. Now, the fact that indigenous people used fire should not surprise us, but the ways in which we, I think, must pay attention to indigenous collaboration with fire these days is a revelation, I think, on the part of many people. If you want a book that takes a pretty darn good look and hard look at this, there's this book, Forgotten Fires, Native Americans and the Transient Wilderness, kind of a hidden classic in a sense of this. And then I just want to race to the fairly contemporary setting of this. This is an indigenous man who has been, is part of our project, and this is a controlled burn. We are learning more and more about controlled or prescribed burns on the Western fire landscapes as an efficient and fairly easy, I mean, there's some technical skill, of course, and safety skill, but fairly easy way to essentially prevent wildfires, or at the very least, prevent fires from climbing into the crowns of trees. Because when they get into the crowns of trees, they leap from tree to tree, and the results are catastrophic. If you can keep fire on the ground, and also if you can thin the trees so that the fire has to struggle a little bit to find a big fuel source, you can, the ways in which you can prevent the out-of-scale catastrophic wildfires is demonstrable. And generally, prescribed burns follow one of two patterns. They're either pile burns, where, as you might imagine, debris from the forest floor and the low-hanging limbs, etc., debris is piled up, fire braked, and burned. That's one. And then another is just a prescribed burn that burns through the landscape and is not just piled up debris, but burns through the landscape, protected on either side or the multiple sides with fire breaks of personnel or landscape change. One of the things we're learning from our indigenous partners about prescribed and cultural burns that I think by definition have cultural practice woven in, protocols of response and regard for the land and for the fire, if not straightforward spiritual meaning. One of the things we're learning from our indigenous collaborators, which it never occurred to me, frankly, and I'm embarrassed as a Western historian, is that many of these burns utilize, and you have to do them in certain seasons. You have to do them before the snow falls in the mountains, but before it heats up too much. There's a tight window where you need to do this, and you don't do them in the summer, obviously. The indigenous communities, particularly the sovereign nations with sovereign territory, there's 100+ reservations in California. Many of those communities have elaborate and time-tested trail systems that are utilized as conduits of stories, as transit corridors for game and people, pretty elaborate, really interesting trail network and trail history. Well, part of the reason the trails are still there is they're utilized as fire breaks. The tribal communities will burn between Trail A and Trail B, well-trod, well-utilized trails, effective fire breaks, and then the next time they'll burn between Trail B and Trail C. So part of what we're trying to do is get the stories of the trails. Who use this? Where does it go? How do you use it in a fire event? And we're starting an oral history project with those individuals who are helping us. And I'll get to some of the particulars of our work with Indigenous communities here in a minute. Okay, the fire as not a discrete event. It's interesting to me that it looks like fire in the top of this photograph is still burning. This is the tragic Montecito complex debris flow of 2018. Santa Barbara and Malibu, seemingly, at the risk of sounding too casual, seemingly burn all the time. We're very interested in that because, in part, with a case study of Malibu, it's clear that the canyons and Santa Ana winds in drought and climate-changed environments become fire funnels. And in Malibu, for instance, and probably in Montecito, the fuel for the fire is often not the chaparral or the tree cover, it's actually the houses themselves. And the fire leaps from house to house to house to house. So one of the things we're trying to do is urge people, as with many an entity, insurance companies leading the way, either don't build there or don't build with that material. Or if you're burned out, don't build exactly the same. And it's ironic how often that seems to happen. Now, the debris flow issue is something about the lack of discreteness of fire events that I think we owe it to our students to understand. And this is not limited, of course not, to California. The Montecito Fire Complex obviously burned up acreage, and it killed, I think, 2 people. And it burned in the hills rising up out of the Pacific Ocean at the southern end of Santa Barbara. Well, then the rains came, and the Californians on the call know this. The rains came, the hillsides had been denuded. There had not been as much work emptying debris basins as perhaps there might have been. And before long, the hills fell down. And they fell down in deadly mudslides that killed far more people within weeks of the fire burning through, and destroyed a great amount of property. And we need to grapple with more the ways in which these events, in fact, are all connected, as everything is in nature. So an understanding of the consequential actions following fire and wildfire and the dangers of being here or there when the rains come is something we need to grapple with, because climate change is telling us that the cyclical swings of major weather events are getting more fierce. And so, yes, hotter and drier, but also in discrete moments, wetter with major storms that, coupled with major fires, can create all kinds of heartbreak on the landscape. And so I think we need to tie that much more to our work as educators in helping people understand that. And this is just another, you can see when nature wants to, when gravity and nature and rain and denuded hillsides want to move extraordinarily heavy things, they will. And it's just tragic that oftentimes neighborhoods are in the way. Okay, before I get back to the indigenous qualities of some of our work here, I want to end with a couple of, the more formal parts of my remarks. Here's an aerial photograph of a suburb, a Western American suburb. It's a new suburb. This is my hometown of Colorado Springs, Colorado. This is the Waldo fire, the Waldo complex fire that burned through where I used to live, where my parents used to live several years ago. I will say that when I grew up at the Air Force Academy and in northern Colorado Springs, we lived facing the Front Range with Pikes Peak looming behind us. The Front Range are the baby Rockies, over which are the big Rockies. And in all my years there, till I graduated from high school, I never once, not a single time, saw them burn. I never saw a fire in the wilderness except for a campfire. In recent years, the Front Range has burned several times to catastrophic results, as you can see here. And in part, the catastrophic results are because that subdivision, which I know it well, I know where it was brand new. It was carved out of formerly essentially wilderness, or close to it, at the very base and climbing up into the Front Range through some of the canyons, and using sophisticated building and leveling techniques that we now are good at, you could bring that landscape down to flat enough that you could build this subdivision. And the fire came through, and these homes and some of the people had no chance. My parents were evacuated twice. They didn't live in this suburb, but they lived nearby. Were evacuated twice in an act that astonished me, because my initial response is, "What do you mean you've been evacuated? There's no fires there." But of course there are. Of course there are. So we need to really study this and learn more about this phenomenon. And then right here, in many ways, I thought I could just put this slide up and we could all just talk, because look at this. 5 of the 10 largest wildfires in California are from 2020. So Andy and I spoke about fire is coming in ways that we all have to be aware of and study. And this is just what happened. All 20 of the top 20 Colorado wildfires date from 2000 forward, with the top 3 in 2020. 2020 saw the most wildfires in Utah history. Arizona, 5 of the biggest wildfires all date from 2000 forward, and the worst wildfire year in Wyoming, 2012. So this is not, if it were a single year, if it were just 2020, I might be tempted to say that's an anomaly. But the data from 2000 forward suggests this is anything but anomalous. And so one of the things we need to do is go to the historic record, go to the tree ring data, go to the indigenous stories, build up patterns of when fire has happened, in part because I think what we're going to find is far fewer back in time that we need to remind people about, that this is not just, again, an anomalous swing that the fires come and go with rain or snow. On the contrary, I don't think that's true. And again, part of the ways in which I think things are tied together, if you go back to my home state, which the snow that falls in Colorado waters LA by way of the Metropolitan Water District's Colorado River Aqueduct. Less snow is falling in the Rocky Mountains and being held in place, so it can drip, drip, drip slowly down through the Continental Divide into the waters of the Colorado River and into the faucets of Pasadena, where I am. More rain is falling because the temperature is warmer, and as compared to snow, and as such, the rain flows off the mountain face faster and dissipates quicker than the drip, drip, drip of snow. But the rain that's falling is not equaling the precipitation that had been falling in previous years. So the landscapes and watersheds of the greater American West are less damp and less likely to be rained upon than in previous generations. And of course, that's going to create increased fire danger. Okay, so let me just go back to very quickly. Andy, do I have a few more minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me just go right back up here. Forgive me for flipping through this. One thing we've done, and it's part of the excitement, and again, particularly for the Southern Californians that are with us, please feel free to contact me and join us for events. Ask questions, put us in touch with your students. One of the things we're doing is utilizing history and humanities-based research about fire regimes and approaches to fire. We're now bringing history to bear on contemporary issues of precisely this nature that you see in this photograph. Working with a team of indigenous tribal communities, private landowners, and actually a Girl Scout camp in the Southern Sierra. The congregation of us have put forward a major grant proposal to a public agency in California to do 3 of these prescribed burns with indigenous partners, private landholders, the Nature Conservancy, and others, because fire demands collaboration of institutional and disciplinary skill. if we get the funding, which I think we will, sometime late in 2021, COVID and weather notwithstanding, we're going to go to these 3 sites and light them on fire as an approach to good fire on the landscape, to learn from Indigenous partners about culture and practice and spiritualism, to learn from private landholders how they protect their land from catastrophic wildfire. And this is where a very big fire burned up near the Big Springs arena in the Southern Sierra a couple of years ago. And it's going to be a case study that then we're going to accompany with oral histories of the folks who are doing the burning. It takes a lot of training, and you have to get certified to put, as they say, to put fire on the landscape. But we're going to build a bank of oral histories, audio and transcripts, to then put them in archives, because as I said to Andy about the rise of fire interest these days, it's only a matter of time before, say, my graduate students or others who are on a PhD track or not, a MA track, are going to show up in larger and larger numbers at archives and say, what do you have on fire? Now, contemporary archival practice through cataloging and Library of Congress classification, et cetera, can find those things. But we're trying to create essentially a notebook for about 6 repositories in the West of historical material, the fire notebooks. So what we have on fire is the letters from this person to that about being burnt out in 1925, or the oral histories done by this burn project that we're doing. So we're building the archive because fire's not going away. On the contrary, I think we should be all scared about it, but I don't think our scare should paralyze us, or our fear should paralyze us. I think we should figure out ways in which collaboration and an appreciation of this pendular change, that the catastrophic fires have arrived with exclamation points in our lives and our landscapes. What do we do about them? And I think it probably goes without saying right now, the answer is not to Smokey Bear them out of existence, out of existence. It's actually to think differently about kinds of fire, places of fire, and people who know fire better than we do. So let me stop right there and see. I'm sure we've got questions. We have a little bit of time left. I hope I haven't talked too long, Andy.
No, this is fantastic, Professor. Thank you. And we do have some questions queued up. I will remind our audience to use the Ask Professor Deverell tab to submit more formal questions. I'll try to cull through what's been in the chat box as well as in this questions tab. Let me actually start with Erica's question, with apologies to Roberto. I promise I'll get your question, Roberto. As a way to maybe segue from what you just concluded on, Erica is also in Los Angeles in Southern California, and she notes that controlled fires are something we use today. However, wildfires seem to be getting worse, and that's certainly illustrated in this last slide that you shared with us. But Bill, I haven't heard you mention a key phrase, I don't think, for the entire webinar, and that is climate change. Talk to us a little bit about your understanding of climate change and the way we can see this in a long view.
Climate change is clearly an actor in this, Andy. Climate change and drought are kind of cousins, I guess. And the hotter, drier landscapes around the globe, but in our work, particularly in the American West, are fire friendly. And so climate change phenomenon is both increasingly understood, I think, but also contains mysteries about these swings in weather events that we think is going to happen, that the fire landscapes will respond to in ways that probably we don't quite know yet. Many of us live near urban wildfire interface, and we may be accustomed to fires nearby. I saw somebody here who had a firsthand experience with our bobcat fire up here in the San Gabriels. As, for instance, the tree canopies where I live in Pasadena get drier, do they become more likely fire alleys into heavily populated areas? Well, certainly fire professionals are thinking about that. How do we utilize our trees as say fire breaks and not fire fuel that the fire is just so opportunistic about it will get them? So I think, yeah, climate change is critical to this. Climate change is the ocean level rise is changing our coastal environments in a pretty big and rapid way. Does that change the ways in which fire moving like it does in Malibu towards the coastline? Does that change the way in which the fire behaves? Undoubtedly. Do we know what that is? Probably not yet. But the sad thing is Malibu is going to burn again. And Malibu becomes a very important case study for us because of the frequency of fires and the fire scars where fire just goes right there again, right there again, right there again. And frankly, because the world pays attention when Malibu burns because of the movie stars.
Yeah, fantastic. Bill, you've talked a lot tonight, obviously, in the context of North America and the United States specifically. Are you aware of, or can you speak at all to the way that other countries or other cultures respond to these same issues?
Yes, the one I know best, and I have to say I don't know it that well, but in my field in the American West, we are trained to pay attention to Australia because of precious mineral rushes and a kind of Australian frontier history that we claim that we have here in the American West, which tends to be a history of conquest and violence. So Australia is often in our comparative framework to think about the American West, and in fire particularly so. So Australian sophistication about fire research and fire knowledge is very high, in part because the Aboriginal population is so versed in fire and being paid attention to both in Australia and New Zealand, with perhaps more attention from the mainstream or dominant non-native society. But Australia has also been victim of just horrendous wildfires in the recent past that have burned millions of acres, destroyed lives and property, and Australia has got to do more about that. And I think I don't know if they're ahead, it's not a contest, I don't know if they're ahead of us, but we pay attention to what they say about fire.
Yeah, thank you. This question comes from Jacqueline, from Jackie, who is in Ohio. We have folks from all over the country in our session tonight in our audience, and while we focused primarily on the American West, she's wondering how school systems or educators or academics can discuss fire in a way that is helpful if you don't live in the West. How can folks in the East Coast or the Midwest initiate these discussions, do you think?
Great question. I think the indigenous histories and cultures across North America are one obvious place to go for learning about fire and fire practice. I also think there's certainly the history of structure fire in wooden America, so colonial America up through the arrival of brick America or something like that. So wooden America burns. So the fire histories will be there, just may take a little digging out of them. And then I also saw that in the chat early on, people had put down the Centralia fire as something that's interesting, a subterranean fire that's burned for a long time and is not out, and probably won't go out for a long time. There are these other long-standing fires that can be that are not necessarily in the American West proper. So one of our case studies is the Badlands of the Dakota Plains, which burned for a year or longer in the late 18th century, probably lightning strike. And we're looking at all the data of that. And then the other thing in terms of, let's say, the Midwest, the geologic record. So the record of 100, 200, 300, 400,000 years ago, geologists and hydrologists have been doing work on the Middle West, rising into the Great Plains for 2 centuries. And so understanding some of their findings, which is just done generally through scientific papers, where they go and find carbon that is embedded in their carbon samples that they take when they core the Earth, and then they write a history of non-human caused fire because it's pre-contact, non-human caused fire, and it might be right in your neighborhood. It just happens to be 250,000 years ago. So I think that's one way of getting students to understand that fire is a multidisciplinary topic.
Yeah. Speaking of, this question comes from Andy in North Carolina, and he's curious if you can speak at all to the other ways we might see this story through other documents or other perspectives, like legal or policy kinds of lenses. Have you done much work on insurance records or city ordinances and zoning? How do these things affect things like fire?
So this is obviously one of the most critical features of the current landscape of fire is risk management and liability generally through property insurance, and also as I mentioned early on, the commitment of public resources to protect private property in the midst of fire, which is on the surface nothing wrong with that. If my house catches on fire, I'd like the fire department to come. But when it happens again and again and again in that same firescape, maybe we should ask some policy questions about zoning and about the insurance companies as you might imagine, insurance companies all across the world are having high-level meetings about risk management and fire, as in, are we going to stay in business? And so the policy ramifications of this are huge, and I think a lot of this is publicly accessible. So, maps that show differential fire insurance costs, or the ways in which the insurance landscape has changed after this or that fire. And then I think we also have the ability to show our students through, Google Earth technology or photographs and rephotographs. We have the ability to show our students, here's a landscape before the fire, here's the landscape after the fire, here's the regenerative landscape. Nature oftentimes really likes a fire because it creates new opportunities, it re-neutrifies the soil, creates new opportunities for growth. The animal populations do different things. But maybe the post-fire photograph 5 years later shows the neighborhoods come back.
Yeah.
Maybe we should ask some hard questions about that.
Great, thank you. Lisa, who's joining us tonight from Brooklyn, is interested in a comment you made earlier about the exquisite writing around fire in fiction and poetry. Do you have any specific texts that you might recommend for younger students, or any gripping nonfiction account? Any titles you'd like to suggest?
So I'm sure many of you, this came to mind immediately. Norman MacLean, the author of River Runs Through It, wrote an absolutely spellbinding book called Young Men and Fire, about a hotshot crew that were killed in a fire in 1949. I think it's 49. And he has a extraordinarily dramatic and tragic discussion about these young men who were teenagers and a little bit older, who were overwhelmed by a wildfire. And so it's every bit as gripping as A River Runs Through It. There is a man named Philip Connors, who's part of our group, and Phil, for 20 years in a row, has climbed into a fire lookout in the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, Smokey Bear country, and utilizing really cool but kind of old-fashioned viewing scopes and these fancy maps that sit on in front of him as he looks out the window of the fire lookout. He's been trained to spot smoke and then call in, usually air support, to put the fire out, or to make a decision whether to put it out. And Phil has written about this. Philip Connors has a book that's about to be in its 10th anniversary printing about being up there and what that's like. It's kind of Thoreauvian. It's sort of Walden Pond goes to a fire tower. He's a brilliant writer, and he's up there thinking, but he's also thinking about fire and smoke. And he goes back up in 10 days for his 20th year. So I'd go there and read that. The world's greatest expert on fire, hands down, is a single person named Stephen Pyne. Kind of curious name for a fire scholar, but it's Pyne. And Steve Pyne knows more than legions of people put together about fire. He's written about fire in the West. He's a former smoke jumper turned professional historian. And so I recommend, he writes like a dream. I recommend anything Steve Pine has written about fire, and you would find many, many books and articles under his byline.
And I will have a little self-promotion and say that Steve Pine was a fellow at the center for two terms, actually, and much of his work is found in our digital library. Bill, let me ask you this. This question comes from Roberto. Thank you, Roberto, for being patient with us. Roberto asked early on in your talk tonight for you to respond to this, and I wonder now, after you've shared, your thoughts and your themes, how the question might change for him. He's curious, how soon or how far in the future do you estimate that Southwestern population will begin to migrate to the northern half of the United States in order to avoid these drastic changes brought about by fires, drought, climate change, etc.? Or is this phenomena already underway? Is it a north-south migration, or is it an east-west?
That is such an interesting question. I think the phenomenon is already underway about internal migration away from environmental challenges, or an attempt to get away from environmental challenges. That said, I suspect people are still moving to Arizona. I think there is a north-south phenomenon to this, but I also think, and I don't have the data, but I also think there's a coastal outmigration because of fear of sea level rise. But maybe more particularly, I think there's a migration of, let's say, venture capital, which I bet you could track, and people from lower to higher elevations, not so much to escape the rising Pacific, but to escape rising heat. So I suspect there's a movement into the higher elevations of the Intermountain American West to, perhaps unconsciously or subconsciously, but nonetheless, to perhaps escape the deleterious effects of heat rise in climate change and drought. In other words, if you could be in the Rockies, it's going to be colder.
Thank you. Last question tonight, Bill. Several years ago, we did a webinar with a scholar named Liz Skelton in Louisiana, who does a lot of work around the language of disasters. And as an East Coast and a Gulf Coast scholar, a lot of that work was around hurricanes and storms, and fires were a part of it, but it was kind of a part of a larger palette of natural disasters in the United States. And one of her arguments was that language really does matter, and that in the humanities, the ways that we describe and ascribe intention, the way that we use language to inspire each other to make changes, that positive language, that the opportunistic language itself can change behavior. Tell us a little bit about the language of fire, and conclude perhaps with letting us know how we can optimistically and in an educative way talk about fire at grade levels, regardless of the grade that we teach.
Great question. I probably don't have any more sophisticated or erudite answer than any of us on the call. I do believe language is a powerful tool. I want to respond in a way to the question to address something I saw in the questions that came at me from the audience about good fire and otherwise. I fundamentally believe there is good fire. I fundamentally believe that we need to learn to live with fire in ways in which are productive to the landscape and do not go into that level of catastrophe to the best that we can help it. And I think part of that solution is to begin to talk about fire precisely in those terms, that fire is a tool. Fire is a mystery. Fire, I'm not sure I want to call it a friend because that anthropomorphizes it, but fire is something that we should and can become more familiar with beyond our gas stoves and fireplaces. And we ought to understand it as something that can be productive to all kinds of life, human and otherwise, and that it has always been with us. It's only in the fairly recent stories of human memory where we've begun to penalize and make our response punitive towards it. And I think that in part has gotten us into this trouble we're in.
Professor Bill Deverell, thank you so much for your insights tonight. I really do appreciate you not only following up on what was a brief conversation over beers to now lead this talk, but for the good work you're doing in Southern California. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the great questions, and I hope that a number of us can stay in touch.
I also want to thank David Tao for joining us in the chat box and sharing so many great resources. Those resources will be available in the folder associated with tonight's webinar. So if they're not there yet, they will be soon. And David has a master document that he will make sure that we share very soon. I want to thank all of you for joining tonight's session of the National Humanities Center webinar series. I would remind you to apply for the Teacher Advisory Council if you are so inclined. I just put the link in the chat box where you can find that application. Also, follow us on our social media. Our Twitter feed, our Facebook handle will all give you updates and new opportunities that we are developing at the center, including information about upcoming webinars like 2 nights from now, when we'll be working with Jerry Kadeva from Northwestern on a session titled Hamilton's America. You may recall that this session was scheduled for earlier this winter, but unfortunately, Professor Kadeva had some throat issues and couldn't join us, but we've rescheduled and we will be launching this session 2 nights from now, March the 18th. I hope you have a great day at school tomorrow. I hope tonight's session will lead to important thoughts and considerations and conversations in your classroom. Have a great day at school. We'll see you next time at the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.